The first reading is a whole program of what should be the perfect pastor. Watching over the flock, and then not perforce but willingly, not in avarice but generously, not lording it over your charges but being examples for the flock. And on it goes. This is the feast of St Pius V in the Old Rite, and it is an interesting case of somebody who combined in his person several strands. It was the man for the hour. As he was Dominican, there was a very large statue of him there in the Angelicum, because the Angelicum, as you know, is the Dominican University in Rome. And they were very much aware of their history with regard to what he was doing. Remember now, he was a great theologian and the man who had to apply, and did apply with great energy, the decrees of the Council of Trent. He reformed the breviary, purging it of all untruth, essentially, because it wasn't sufficient that something should be edifying for it to be put in the Church's liturgy, notably in the breviary. There's an old French saying, menteur comme un deuxième nocturne, lying as a second nocturne. The second nocturne would give you the story of the saint, and therefore it might be puzzlingly interesting, a bit too much so at times, and that all had to go. Truth is more edifying than its fake. And that's why a true story actually is far more powerful than just a made-up one. It has the advantage of being, as it were, a virtual video of what happened actually in real time. The other one is just the figment of one's imagination. So he also, and this is of course for us a very big one, reformed the Missal. It was those that had a history of more than 200 years that were allowed to be maintained locally and in orders, like precisely Dominicans actually. The others had to conform. And that was, as time was going to be evolving, a great advantage. Why? Well, this very period was the one when the New World was becoming very important, and other great conquests in time and geography as well. Remember how it was actually a pope, one of the Borgia popes, who had the brilliant idea of making a demarcation between the influence of Portugal and that of Spain. And that explains how a massive chunk, Brazil, is Portuguese in language, and the others essentially are Spanish in Latin America. So it was a time when they were aware of henceforth not a European church, but a worldwide church. And to have one volume that if actually printed quite small, can fit nearly into your pocket, a big pocket, but still it would do, is a very good acquisition for by now a worldwide church, what was going to have a universal liturgy, the same everywhere and on every altar. Now actually, in a sense, we, since the Second Vatican Council, are at a disadvantage with regard to that one, because you can't easily put all the liturgy in one volume. You will notice that we have different volumes for the lectionary. That's the fruit of a very rich development in the readings that we have, but it's cumbersome as regards taking volumes from A to B, and also the missal itself has to be apart, with no readings in it. So it's actually more cumbersome. However, there are ways and means of getting around that. The other B-side of what we have now compared with what was there before is that a lot more variation, as you know, takes place in geography, because each local area can be quite independent nowadays with regard to the way that norms are applied. It's not as simple as it was only a generation or two ago, when one was at home in any church throughout the world. But having said that, when compared with the Eastern Church, we still have a certain universality and ubiquity which they find difficult to have. Why? They're very much aware of their nationalistic roots. A church is a national church in its origin, and that is felt when one goes from A to B in the Eastern Bloc. We just go to any Catholic church and we know it's our church. Now I want to zoom into these centuries that separate what happened just before actually the death of this great pontiff in 1572 and what we have lived through, or the aftermath thereof. 1570, of course, is echoed in 1970. And I would like to just, in a sense, bring to the fore one phrase that the discreet but profound Benedict XVI put in that document, which was encouraging bishops to be aware of the importance of the history of the Church liturgically. In inviting the bishops to not misunderstand what he was doing, he was explaining that what has always been in the past the most sacred of all cannot suddenly be regarded as something to be shunned. It's actually an indication of the lack of culture in the first instance, but certainly a lack of depth in the case of those who think that they know better than the saints who have sanctified themselves with what has always worked and which still works perfectly well. And by the way, it's not so simple, because what enters into play quite often is an avoidance of humiliation, because a priest who now has not learnt Latin and has no awareness of basically how things used to be done, who's never experienced it, can certainly not celebrate it, will therefore wiggle out of an embarrassing situation by indicating that it is retrograde to want it, as though that priest or even that bishop is superior. It's an indirect way of getting one's own back against what is a threatening situation, because in the back of their mind they know they should really know Latin. It's still a part of the curriculum, but it's actually rarely done properly. And so they get out of it by, as it were, getting the impression that they're in a superior and not inferior situation. They've grown out of it. Well, multiply that by also a vast number of lay people, and you have a situation where those who are more rich in cultural awareness and perhaps more sensitive in things spiritual are classed massively as retrograde and need to, as we would say, cop on finally. Whereas perhaps it's the reverse that would be more true. Why? Not to be aware that the very element of silence and vertical orientation is far more mystical in nature than that of an assembly that all the time can only interact with each other on the level of facial contact, is to indicate that they perhaps are not aware of the depth of the problem, because we're only actually seeing the tip of the iceberg. If one notices the dynamics at work in many a celebration now, there is not really an opportunity for intimacy. It's just too difficult to find a space within an unstoppable flow of words and interaction to engage in depth with the one that actually we're really there for. And if you don't believe me, look around. And therefore, one sees why Benedict XVI was profoundly aware that those who were getting away with all this were the ones that were being defended by the structure of the church, whereas those who had perhaps greater depth were being ostracized and put in this retrograde bracket. You see how he was very much aware of the real problem. It's far more deep than people actually think, and the fruits can be seen. I just conclude. I was in London a few weeks ago talking to a young Norbertine because I had to discuss the question with regard to getting the message through to the nuncio with regard to the problems there at home. And he, over about 3 hours of conversation, all in Welsh, was able, because he's very much aware of what's going on in London, having worked for years as a factotum in the cathedral in Westminster and knows everybody, bishops included, was able to tell me this calmly, and he's very balanced. He said, with regard to the situation in the church, they know it. That is, this question of it's only really in the bracket of the traditional, classic, that vocations nowadays are seriously to be found. And he went on to explain, the bishops know it, but they can't say it. And therefore, it's an interesting situation, because they've tried everything, massive vocation drives, everything, which should be spectacularly effective, but the fruit is what it is. And even when they get a vocation and ordain him, often he leaves afterwards. A priest recently ordained in this diocese is in the process now, only about 2 or 3 years down the line of leaving. So, what is all this saying? Compare that with the way that there, where people are able on a regular basis to engage heart to heart in the mystic silence of a celebration which is purely Godward, and the way that that leads to a solid vocation where heart has met heart and will not betray heart, that is quite different. Coupled with the whole protection of purity, because that's part of the problem. If in the seminary doesn't have a profound formation in prayer, and they're handling all kinds of things on internet, there's a huge danger that this other bit, the intimacy with Jesus Christ, is going to be so crowded out by even the good things they have to do, because even they are engaged in weekends and all this activity, not mystical or contemplative, in such a way they get to ordination with having run all the way through the seminary without hardly a pause. And then when ordained, they're plunged in a parish where they're doing a lot of work, usually the work of about 5 priests, rushing and rushing all the time. Compare that with the life that a priest would have if he had, at least at the altar, a mystic moment where he doesn't even see the people. There it's different. So what has worked will always work, and where God is honoured, he will bless those who honour him. So over to you, Lord, would be perhaps the real answer to a vocations crisis.